So, guys, I want to talk about the Don Callis family, and I do think that this is a very important video because they had some controversies this week on AEW Dynamite where they gained two more members, and also with that said, they have roughly about like over 10 people in the group because they do have Wardlow, and another person that's they have Wardlow, and they also have another person on the group that's injured on Brian Cage, and then also too you also count Don Callis, so he roughly has around like 13 people. And the other big issue about Don Callis, and that needs to be talked about, is that he's very overfeatured on AEW because I think this week's show, he was actually, on AEW Dynamite for an hour. And there are some times, too, where almost like a majority of Collision tapings and other tapings, you're going to see Don Callis a few times in a night, really. And I think that while he's a really great heel, he instigates the audience, people don't like him. There is a point of oversaturation. There could be a point where he becomes a little bit like Jeff Jarrett in TNA wrestling, where it's always about him, or he could become a little bit like Bully Ray in TNA wrestling. Like when he was a champion, it actually killed, one of the things that killed the company was Bully Ray being the champion because it was always about him and what he wanted to do, really. So there is a issue of definitely over featuring him, and there's also issue of him having too many members. And I also want to mention there's a third issue of Don Callis family is. And a lot of people don't talk about this, is that I don't like his relationship with Kyle Fletcher, like this homoeroticism, because you have to be really careful that definitely just trying to tease two men being sexually attracted to each other is very offensive, because there's a difference between two people who are gay and they like each other and somebody trying to pretend that they're gay or pretend that they're interested. In each other, really, because that leads to stereotypes like Buck and Chuck, really. But I think that honestly, if there is an attraction or relationship with them that they want to do, fine. But if not, then ultimately just don't be kind of like teasing just to be fun, really, because it's just not. It's a very, very dated thing. It's like the Buck and Chuck in WWE, where Billy Gunn and Chuck Palumbo were trying to tease that they're homosexual and they weren't really. Like, yes, there was a lot more tolerance for that type of taboo humor in the early 2000s, but nowadays, teasing homoeroticism is just, a little offensive. So I do want to talk a little bit about the Don Callis family and other issues. That I do think that, yes, they have way too many members, and it leads to Don Callis coming out way too much, really. The other issue is that there's an upper echelon and a lower echelon of the Don Callis family. Like right now, the upper echelon is really Konosuke Takeshita and Okada and Kyle Fletcher. Like these are the people that will not lose that much, really. And then the lower echelon really is, Hechicero, Rocky Ramiro, and there's and Lance Archer, and Brian Cage, because they always usually lose. I made a diss rap called "The Losing Cage" because they always lose, really. So it's almost like you have a faction, but then you have like three or four people that are actually doing well, usually win all the time. And then you always have people who always lose. So it's almost like, realistically, if you are in charge of like 10 or 12 people, wouldn't you want to get rid of your weak members or say, hey, you guys, you've been stinking up the rear. So, I'm going to give you a 3-strike policy. That's one of the issues too, that it just doesn't make sense for having this many people and have people on his team lose and whatever. The other issue with the Don Callis family is that they are the Will Ospreay jobbers. I've kind of given them that title, that whenever they have a match with Will Ospreay, what happens? They always lose. The majority of the time they lose. If it's Will Ospreay or Kenny Omega, they're like Ash Ketchum and Ash and his friend from Pokemon, and Don Callis family's like Team Rocket when it comes to them. They always have to lose to them. And there's been times too where Ospreay has been selfish. Like when it was Kyle Fletcher versus Ospreay, Kyle Fletcher should have won that, the steel cage match. So that's also another issue too, is that if you bring back Will Ospreay or you do Ospreay and Swerve as a tag team, more than likely Don Callis is going to lose the majority of that stuff. The other issue with them is that they do not have direction and championship goals, really. Like, yes, you have Kyle Fletcher with the TNT title, but you have enough people to say something like, hey, what if they challenge Bandito and they actually keep the titles? Because I think that would actually be a good thing. You can do something like, say, the Don Callis family, all the members are the tag team champions, but one of the dangerous things about the Don Callis family being the tag team champions is that you're going to have a random two people and you don't know who it's going to be really defending the titles. That could be something interesting, but they've been around for like at least 4 or 5 years, if I remember correctly, really, but they've never ever pursued the tag team champions or held the tag team championships. And that's also really embarrassing because they have the trios title. And the trios title in AEW, I think, is very, very underrated. There's so many great teams. You have the Don Callis family, you have LFI, you have Dalton Castle and the Outrunners, you have Hobbs, Joe, and Katsuyori Shibata, you have the Death Riders. You can easily find another member to hang out with Joe and Hook, and then also Jurassic Express is back, so they can actually, find another member as well. Really, you can take Shane Taylor Promotions. Really, like the trios division is very, very underrated. But you're actually at this point, really, with the trios. MXM, you also have, John Morrison. He is a draw. You have Taya Valkyrie, and this would help Taya Valkyrie. She was a manager, and then she actually wrestled on the women's division in the roster. And then Taya Valkyrie's a former TNA champion, and she and John Morrison are highly underrated. So, part of that would be what would happen if the Don Callis family hold the trios title or go after that or rival the Death Riders? Because, could you imagine John Moxley in a trios match against the Don Callis family? Then you have Moxley, Kyle Fletcher, Moxley, Okada, Moxley, Takeshita, Moxley, Josh Alexander, Moxley, somebody else really. And that should be the goal of the trios titles. For example, the Hurt Syndicate should be the trios champion. Imagine if you did Hurt Syndicate versus the Ops and you had a stare down between Hobbs and Lashley, and you're teasing Hobbs and Lashley at Wembley Stadium, which it would be a big motherfucking draw, really. Or you tease like Lashley and Joe. And I don't think Lashley and Joe ever faced each other. I think maybe in TNA Wrestling, but I'm not sure if they did, but most people don't remember that. But the point of it is that it doesn't make sense for Don Callis' family to actually, exist for this long and not even go after those titles. Because, wouldn't a faction want to go after our tag team or trios title? The other issue with the Don Callis family, and I think that this is very, very true, is that, like I said, they're very directionless. I think that they just have match after match after match, really. Like, I know, like, Don Callis has mentioned things about titles, but a lot of the times, it's like after that, they're there to exist for a while. And I also think the other thing to add with them is that they're the jobber squad. That, they're also, like, the championship jobbers. And what this means is that when Bandito has a match in Ring of Honor, you had against Takeshita and Hechicero, they lose. When you have Hangman, Kyle Fletcher lost, really. So it's always like that thing, too, is that when it comes to the biggest titles in the company, which, is the Ring of Honor title and also the, the ROH, the Ring of Honor heavyweight title and the AEW men's heavyweight title, they always usually lose, really. So that's kind of also that type of thing I've said about what I call them Team Rocket, really. Like, whenever it's the big one, they usually lose. But I will also say with the Don Callis family, 100% that they are the best faction in AEW history, because really you have 3 members of their family right now that are actually mega over, that started in the Don Callis family. You had Kyle Fletcher, really. Like, he did some stuff before Don Callis, but actually joining the Don Callis family really helped him out and stuff like that. Like, that made him a star. He is, if you put him on a pay-per-view, he is somebody that you must see. The other person that you had, it was Kenny Omega. While he was not part of the Don Callis family, Don Callis and his feud and other things that he did helped him out, really. So definitely he's one of those people as well that benefited from Don Callis, really. So, and the biggest person is Will Ospreay. So, Will Ospreay actually benefited from the Don Callis family as well, really, because obviously you look at somebody like Will Ospreay and his story, like being in the family, getting out of the family, was actually like very, very helpful, for him, really. And that actually kind of launched. Like last year, like the match at Revolution, him and Takeshita, when, they wanted to just do a pissing contest of who's better, that started that rhythm of Ospreay was not really new to. He was not known to a. He was not really known to a Western audience that well. So he in his match. He in that match with Takeshita at he in his match at Takeshita at Revolution, Sting's retirement match. It was good showcasing. And then also too, they just gambled, and one of the biggest draws, probably the most memorable match of Wrestle Dynasty last year, were two matches. Swerve winning the AEW championship. When I swerve, when I drive, when I swerve, when I drive, you beating me, you lost your mind. I fucking missed that Nana dance so much. But that was like the most memorable thing. I had to tell you that because obviously, that did a lot. That there was a huge aftermath of Swerve becoming champion, but Swerve's not Don Callis' family. But what I'm talking about is Ospreay versus Takeshita. Like that was Ospreay versus Bryan Danielson. Considered one of the greatest professional wrestling matches. I was there really, and I remember like before the match started, everybody stood up and they lost their shit really because they're like, holy shit, this is almost like Shawn Michaels versus Ospreay, or like this was something very, very special. This would be like AJ Styles versus Shawn Michaels in the Ruthless Aggression era. That was that level of, and it was also a generational match. It was Bryan Danielson from, the mid 2000s versus Will Ospreay, who, now is rising to popularity. But that came from working with Don Callis, and then you led to Kyle Fletcher and Ospreay having a feud, which was one of the best feuds and one of the best match feuds of last year. And then also too, the other part of it is, I mentioned everybody else. I mentioned Konosuke Takeshita. And that's very important because the issue with a lot of American wrestling is a lot of Japanese and Asian wrestlers don't get over. But working with Don Callis' family, he had Takeshita versus Ospreay. You also had Takeshita versus Ricochet and Ospreay. You had Takeshita versus Bandito. You had Takeshita versus Ospreay Part 2, I believe, in I think it was Part 2 or Part 3 at if I remember, that was in the Boston show, and really the Boston show, when you put the titles on Samoa Joe, the trios titles, and Takeshita versus Ospreay, that whole thing really started a positive momentum with AEW this year. Like, it was really Death Riders were in a lull, put the company in a lull, but one of the things that got out of that lull was Joe and the Ops become the trios champion, nerfing, really starting to nerf the Death Riders. And then also you had Ospreay and Takeshita, because they were really trying to make a show in Boston that people wanted to see. And then the next part of it, that's very powerful and very important, is that, you did Takeshita Bandito, and now a lot of people are talking about Bandito, saying that he's great matches, and the first time that's ever happened in my memory is that Bandito, he had dollar bills being thrown at him by fans, because they're saying, like, you and Takeshita did such a hell of a match, really, that we want to put attention on you. And sadly, you just had Mask of Dorada, Takeshita, and Okada. And Mask of Dorada, he just delivered like a crazy motherfucker at that match. But honestly, they tried to make Dorada, and they did Dorada versus Hologram, no, Dorada versus Clone. That's what they should do at Wrestle Dream. I'll make a video about it. I'll text Tony Khan's crazy Tyrone Bigham's ass in just a few minutes. But that's definitely a match that they should have, really. But Mask of Dorada became somebody. Bandito became somebody, part of the Don Callis family, really. So that's also the other thing too, that there is no other faction in AEW history that has built multiple stars, really. You can argue Jericho helped MJF, but MJF was somebody who he needed to work with established people to get introduced, really, but he ran with his ball, really. So I'll give you that Jericho helped MJF, but a majority of that was MJF had the mic skills and whatever, really. He didn't spend that much time with Chris Jericho. But ultimately, the most profitable faction, the faction that made the most stars in AEW, and actually has made babyface stars, like Bandito became a bigger deal, Ospreay became a bigger deal, Mask of Dorada has a future if they actually book him well, really. Hologram versus Clone would be something great, really, but I think Hologram versus Mask of Dorada should happen. No, Evil Hologram versus Mask of Dorada should happen. I really, really think that, and then Wardlow's in the group, and maybe Wardlow can become a bigger star because he's lost a lot of momentum. But ultimately, the best faction in AEW is the Don Callis family, and I think maybe the most controversial faction is Don Callis family because on the other side, there's over featuring of Don Callis on television. It will run its course. There's a story that he's a predator. He's done sexual harassment in TNA wrestling, so it kind of makes us wonder, just like when they had Mike Tyson, just like when they had Darby Allin, there's alleged sexual assault allegations on Darby Allin. People were working with Joey Ryan a few years ago. There is that controversy around him. But the other part of it is also, too, that in addition to being a controversial figure, in addition to kind of being overfeatured, there's also the "fuck Don Callis" chant, which is it gets to a point like with Tony Storm where it's just a little too repetitive as well, really. So I mean, there's ups and downs to the Don Callis family, but I definitely think having more members is detrimental because obviously it becomes a little bit like a quick fix, really. And I do think that's not good, really. Like, I think that you need to kind of experiment with more people. And then also the other issue with AEW is that they don't have a lot of singles baby faces. They had Anthony Bowens for a while, and now they had Eddie Kingston. They put him in a group. They had Hook. They put him in a group, really. But now you have more tag teams than single stars, and it's almost like who's really going to happen, who's really going to be that person. And I think that should be Takeshita, but you might even have to do something where Takeshita takes 5 members of the Don Callis family. He forms his own faction, but what he does is he fights the Don Callis family, but he says, we're also single stars. We're going to do this stuff. Or like I said about Anthony Bowens and Max Caster, they need to be a tag team, but they also need to go after single stars. Do what they did with Kofi Kingston, where he was he was part of the New Day, and he counted as a tag team champion, but he was also the WWE champion. They have to do that with Don Callis family or a babyface who's in a tag team now because there's so many more there's way more babyface there's way more baby faces there's way more there's way more heel there's a lot more heels than there's a lot more baby faces, and sometimes I think that they may say, hey, we don't know how to get people over, or hey, somebody may not know how to speak English so well, or somebody may not have good mic skills, let's throw them with Don Callis family. But that's kind of like a band-aid on a bigger wound, really. But as I said, it's to the point where, like I said, I think in the future it's going to lead to just, it's going to become it's becoming like the NWO. It's a little overfeatured, it's an overdone gimmick, and there's no goals and directional. Like their direction should be, we want to take over AEW. I don't care about rivaling other heels like the Death Riders. I don't care about or even you can do something where Don Callis family's like saying enough is enough, real. They beat down John Moxley and he set up amends on Blood and Guts. But the Don Callis family and maybe Hangman, whatever, they join forces, like Moxley and the Death Riders and Hangman and the Ops join forces against Don Callis family. That could be really interesting, like, the villains and the babe faces getting together, because sometimes in superhero films, you may see you see Shadow the Hedgehog and Sonic the Hedgehog team up together against a greater evil. You could do something like that, or even like in the tournament in the Dragon Ball Z Super, you had Frieza and Goku on the same side, really. So you can kind of do something. That doesn't happen a lot in professional wrestling, but if the Don Callis family wants to take over AEW, you can have that, really. And I also think the other issue is the epilogue, and it's almost like, what do you get out of Don Callis being the heel manager long term, really, and I hate saying this, he's in his 60s, he'd be dead in 10 to 20 years, really. It's almost like, what do you do, and like, what's the end game? Are you gonna have Don Callis for the rest of TNA for the rest of AEW, and whatever, really, So I really just think there's a lot of just kind of like, where do you book the Don Callis family? Where do you make it strong? Where do you have more payoffs? Where do you have like emotional stories? Where can you do something interesting, like have heel teams and babyface teams take them on in like a blood and guts match? Like, that would be really cool. Or you can even do something like, say, okay, well, he says now enough is enough. I want everything. We're gonna take over all of AEW because we have the most people. We got to have all the championships. We're gonna do we're gonna take 5 members and we're gonna like take over Ring of Honor. Imagine if you had like Lee Moriarty, versus Clone, or Lee Moriarty versus like Takeshita or somebody else, and you build like Lee Moriarty and other people like that. So, or you have Okada versus Lee Moriarty, or you have Okada versus Bandito. Like, that would be a hell of a match for Death Before Dishonor, Final Battle in Ohio, that would be a hell of a match to have, really. So I mean, like, there's so many things that they can do with the Don Callis family, but I do think that, as I said, because AEW is directionless for the most part, there's a lot of matches and ideas and stories that they can do. Really, there's also that other thing too, as I said, really, that that Don Callis himself, I don't really think he has to go. He may go after titles and then he drops it. He may care about wins and losses because that leads to championships, but then he has Hechicero, Rocky Romero, and Lance Archer lose all the time, especially in the main events of shows, really. So, it's like, I think he's almost like the Tony Khan of AEW. They have him overworked. He does everything. He wants to, be on top and win, really, but he's kind of like a little oversaturated. So I think maybe vicariously, he is almost like, Tony Khan in a way, really. He's probably a professional wrestling version of Tony Khan, manages multiple people. He has winners, he has losers, he has people that he neglects, really. He has people that he features well, really, if you kind of think about it. But he is very directionless. He needs to be like, no, the goal is to take over AEW. He needs to also recruit some women because I would imagine that, part of taking over a company would be having some female wrestlers to get the women's titles. And there's Thunder Rosa that he could have. There's also Nyla Rose, Bozilla. There's other people that he can have as well, really, that are women that could do something. Bozilla had the match at Full Gear. No, had the match at Forbidden Door. What if they had Stephanie Vakir and she was like the female in the Don Callis family? There's a lot of shit that they can do, really. So I do feel it's very, very unfortunate that I think that there's a lot of great things Don Callis family has done, really, but there's definitely really issues with the direction of adding more members. There's also an issue of a lot of the members not being able to speak English that well, so he has to kind of overdo it. And then he's also featured a lot on different shows. And then also, too, that a lot of his members are directionless. I mean, he has his winners, he has his mid people that he doesn't talk about that much. And then he also has his jobbers, really, And then you also have people like Josh Alexander, who's his mid person, which, he wins, he loses. He doesn't win the big one because they don't want him to win the big one in AEW. And then also, he's usually in other promotions, whatever, really, So there's a lot of just, there's just a lot of issues with how it can be booked better. But I definitely want to talk about all the issues with the Don Callis group. It's as I said, it's definitely their best factions, build the most stars. It's actually building baby faces as well, really. But ultimately, it has to have a direction. They have to think about dream matches, and ultimately, they have to think about big moments. Like, really, Wembley Stadium, there's so many great matches you can have with the Don Callis family versus everybody else, really. So that's all I got to say. It's definitely a clusterfuck.